The autumn of 1889 did not announce itself with any grandeur in the township of Hoolitic, Indiana. It came the way it always came to that pocket of the southern hills, with a thinning of the light over the cornfields, a sharpening of the wind that carried the smell of wood smoke down from the ridges, a quiet settling of the land into its long preparation for cold. In a kitchen of unpainted pine boards, a man of 78 years sat alone at a table he had eaten at for half a century, and before him lay a single sheet of telegraph paper that his great-nephew had carried at a gallop from the wire office in Bedford. The boy had ridden the animal nearly to ruin to bring it. The old man read the figure printed there, set the paper down, smoothed it flat with the heel of a hand gone spotted and trembling, then read it again. He did not speak. Somewhere beyond the window a crow called once and went silent, as though it too understood that whatever had just happened in the world was too large for ordinary sound. To grasp the meaning of that number, a person must first walk the ground it grew out of, must stand at the lip of a great wound carved into the earth and look down into water the color of a robin's egg, and must understand that the men who opened that wound believed to their dying breath that its only value lay in what could be hauled out of it by main strength. The Vance family had never owned a farm in the manner their neighbors understood the word. They had owned a hole. They had owned a thing that swallowed money the way the Quarry pond swallowed stones thrown by trespassing boys, without ripple, without protest, without end. The Quarry had been opened in the spring of 1851 by the old man's father, a stone-minded son of immigrants named Corrigan Vance, who paid $100 in gold coin for 80 acres of ground that every sensible farmer in the county had declared worthless. The soil ran thin as a widow's purse over that parcel, too rocky for a plow to bite, too steep in places for anything but goats. Corrigan was no tiller of fields. He was a man who could read the bones of the land the way a preacher read scripture, finding in the gray ledges and the broken outcrops a meaning that his neighbors passed by without a glance. Beneath that grudging topsoil lay a seam of Salem limestone, pale as cream, fine as old ivory, dense with the ghosts of a vanished inland sea. It was the same stone that would one day face the proud buildings rising in Indianapolis, the banks and courthouses meant to stand 1,000 years. Corrigan saw it, knelt, and put his palm flat against a cut face of it, then bought the land before the week was out. For the better part of 3 decades, the Vance limestone concern blasted and chiseled and dragged its harvest out of that ground. The work was brutal beyond the telling. Men lost fingers to the splitting wedges, lost backs to the endless lifting, lost the hearing in one ear or both to the daily detonations that rolled across the township like the wrath of an offended god. Yet, the work paid in a steady, honest way that the hill country rarely offered, so that the Quarry came to feed near half the men of Hoolitic. Wagons groaned up the access road, laden with squared blocks bound for the rail spur 6 miles distant. From there the stone traveled to cities those teamsters would never see, to be admired by people who would never know the name of the place it came from. The lesser rubble went to gravel the county roads. The work produced money. It produced a hard kind of pride, and it produced 2 generations of Vance men after Corrigan, marked by the same grave silence, the same stone dust ground permanently into the creases of their knuckles, so that even washed and dressed for church, their hands looked carved rather than born. Then in the autumn of 1881, the seam thinned to nothing worth the taking. A younger operation opened nearer the rail line at Bedford and undercut every price. The cost of hauling Vance stone the long miles to the spur swelled past what any buyer would pay, and the thing simply stopped. The company that had once carried 87 men on its payroll closed its gate with 11 left to draw a final wage. Corrigan himself had been laid in the churchyard a decade before that gate ever swung shut, and so it fell to his son, the old man now bent over the telegraph paper to lock it. Silas Vance was 70 that autumn, and he turned the key with hands that had bled into the work since boyhood, hung it on the nail beside the kitchen door, and felt nothing in his chest but the lifting of a weight he had carried his whole life long. What the closing left behind was a terraced pit some 900 feet long and 400 wide at its broadest, its floor lying 110 feet below the surrounding fields, its walls dropping in sheer cut steps that no living thing could climb. Season upon season, the rain came, the groundwater wept through the porous limestone, and slowly the floor of the pit filled with water of a stillness and a blueness that unsettled everyone who looked upon it. The color belonged to no Indiana pond. It was the color of deep cold places, of glacier melt, of things better left unseen, fed perpetually by seepage through 100 feet of mineral stone, so that even at the height of August, the surface lay flat as poured glass and gave back the sky without the smallest tremor. The remaining 67 acres of the original parcel were sold off in pieces across the lean years to satisfy the creditors until all that carried the Vance name was the wound itself. 12 acres and 7/10 of vertical rock scrub brush clinging to the upper rim, and that motionless, unnerving water at the bottom of everything. Silas alone among all his line had hated the quarry with a clean and steady passion from the first hour he was old enough to be put to work in it. He was born the same spring his father drove the first wedge into the seam raised in the noise and the white dust set to labor below the rim, while still a boy, and kept at it until he was an old man, and across the whole of that long life he had come to loathe every aspect of the trade with the particular bitterness of a man trapped in a calling he never chose. He hated the noise that left his head ringing past midnight. He hated the white dust that coated his throat until water tasted of chalk. He hated the way the work used men up and discarded them, the way it had hollowed his own father into a stooped, silent stranger before the churchyard took him. When the closing came, the township mourned, but Silas felt only relief, and he turned his back on stone the way a freed prisoner turns his back on a cell. He had gone into the selling of insurance years before the gate ever closed, working it alongside the quarry through its slow decline and giving himself to it wholly once the stone was done, because he found in it the one thing the quarry had never offered him, a logic that made sense, a world of clean columns where risk could be named, measured, priced, and set against premium until the page balanced. He sold policies to farmers afraid of fire, to shopkeepers afraid of theft, to widows afraid of the wolf at the door, and he was uncommonly good at it because he believed in it utterly. A thing had value or it did not. A thing earned its keep or it was cut loose. There was no sentiment in a ledger, and Silas had learned young that sentiment was the most expensive luxury a poor man could buy. To his cold and ordered mind, the quarry was not heritage, was not history, was not even land in any useful sense. It was liability, pure and undiluted, a debt that arrived punctually each year wearing the costume of an asset. The law had a phrase for what the quarry was, and Silas had cause to learn it well, an attractive nuisance. Each year the county relieved him of tax money upon ground that returned not one copper cent. Each summer he wore out boot leather, chasing the township boys who slipped through the sagging fence to dare the cold blue water, daring it the way the young always dare the things that have killed others in the unshakable certainty of their own immortality. That certainty broke in the summer of 1860. A boy of 14 from the next county over visiting cousins swam out past the ledge where the bottom fell away to nothing, took a cramp in the killing chill of that mineral water, and went down before the others on the bank understood that his thrashing was not play. They never recovered him until the third day. The suit that followed consumed a sum equal to 2 full years of everything Silas had managed to scrape from his policies, and worse than the money it fixed the quarry in his mind forever after. not as a place, but as an enemy, a thing crouched at the edge of his life, waiting to ruin him, a second time, a negative number that no honest labor seemed able to drive to zero. From that grave forward, he wanted only one thing from the family ground: to be free of it. He offered it for sale first, in 1862, asking $1,000, and not a soul in 3 counties came to look. A man might as well have advertised a fever for sale, or a debt, or a bad dream. In 1866, he proposed gifting the whole of it to the county for use as a refuse pit, and the county sent a surveyor who shook his head over the porous bedrock and explained that whatever rot was buried there would leach straight down into the very groundwater the township drank, and the offer died on the spot. In 1871, he came near to closing with a contractor who meant to fill the pit with the spoil of an excavation in the city until the cost of carting that filled the long miles south proved to swallow any profit, and that hope went the way of all the others. For close to 30 years, this became the very rhythm of the man's life, a fresh scheme blooming in him each season like a hardy weed, a brief and almost shameful flush of hope, then the slow arithmetic of distance and cost crushing it flat once more. The pit was too vast, too deep, too far from anything a sensible enterprise required. It was, as he told his daughter in 100 wearied variations, worthless, worse than worthless. It was a drain in the floor of his accounts through which his small, hard-won prosperity forever threatened to run away. His daughter did not see it so. Marin Vance had turned 40 in the spring of that year, the child of Silas's middle age born when he had near given up on children at all, and the township knew her chiefly for a patience so deep it bordered on the unsettling, the patience of a woman who could sit motionless an hour, watching a thing too slow for ordinary eyes to perceive any change in at all. Where her father looked upon the quarry and saw a ruinous debt, she looked upon the same gray walls and the same blue water and saw a thing whole and living and intricate beyond his reckoning, a household of 10,000 quiet tenants, each going about its ancient business in the cold shade. She had walked the rim since she was small enough to slip her hand into a man's and be led in the years before the drowning and the fences that came after, when a child might still scramble down the old quarryman's track to the broad ledges and spend a whole afternoon turning over stones to see what slept beneath. She knew the place the way a mother knows a sleeping child, by signs invisible to any stranger. She knew that the north-facing walls, which the sun never touched from one solstice to the next, wore a carpet of moss so thick that a hand pressed into it came away wet in the dead heat of August. She knew the water at the bottom held its temperature near 52 degrees the year around summer and winter alike, a constancy no surface pond could ever match. She knew the air in the deep cuts ran a full 15 degrees cooler than the open fields above, that the high walls trapped the morning dew long past the hour. The meadows had burned dry, that the whole sunken world breathed out a damp, cool exhalation a person could feel on the skin, like the breath of something enormous and asleep. She had never sat in a college lecture hall, for in the Indiana of those years, such doors stood barred against a woman of small means as surely as if they had been mortared shut. What she carried instead, she had gathered with her own hands across a lifetime of stubborn attention. As a girl of 17, she had spent 3 years as helper to an aging apothecary in Bedford, a man named Abner Whitfield, who had passed his long bachelor's life amassing the plants and minerals of the region into pressed sheets and labeled drawers. He taught her to look through a magnifying lens until the broad, ordinary world resolved into its secret architecture, into spores and cell walls and the branching threads of things that fed upon decay. When he died, he willed her a great wooden chest of his books, the botany and the materia medica, and a long run of scientific journals he had subscribed to for 40 years. And, across the winters, since she had read them past, memorizing by the wavering light of an oil lamp, until the knowledge in them had become less a thing she possessed than a way she saw. It was from those pages that her fascination with fungi had first taken root, not at the quarry, but in the lamplit quiet of her own mind. She had learned the truth that overturned every childish assumption that the mushroom is no plant at all, but a kingdom unto itself, neither animal nor vegetable, an agent of rot and renewal, both the hidden engine that breaks down the fallen tree, so that the forest may rise green again from its ruin. She came in time to regard these things, not as the corruption ordinary folk took them for, but as patient architects, builders, working in the dark, transmuting death into the materials of life with a craftsmanship no human hand could equal. The dead log was not waste to her as it was waste to her father. It was a cathedral waiting to be raised. The idea, when it finally came, did not arrive as lightning, but gathered the way weather gathers slow and from many quarters at once. One February evening, deep in a chest-bottom volume of Whitfield's journals, she came upon an account of growing mushrooms in cellars, of how certain growers in shadowed underground rooms cultivated a pale, fleshy mushroom upon beds of composted, stable manure mixed with mineral earth, holding the temperature steady through every season of the year by the simple fact of being below the reach of frost and sun alike. One sentence among the close-set lines lodged in her chest, like a seed slipping into a crack of warm soil and refusing thereafter to be dislodged, a substrate rich in calcium, and the deeper minerals appeared to heighten the savor of the resulting flesh past anything cultivated in ordinary ground. Limestone was calcium given solid form, the water at the bottom of the family pit, having wept its slow way through 100 feet of that pale stone, was a cold mineral broth saturated with the very element the account named. The quarry itself, with its sunless northern walls, its trapped and ceaseless damp, its temperature held constant as a cellar's, by the great mass of rock surrounding it, was nothing other than such a growing room raised to a scale no human builder could attempt. A vault dug, not by any straining gang of laborers, but by the patient hand of the earth across an age of ages. Men toiled with pick and barrow to hollow out their cellars by the foot. The earth had already hollowed one for the Vances by the acre, and her father had spent a lifetime praying for someone to come fill it in. That winter, Marin drew out the small store of money she had set by across the lonely, careful years, near to the whole of what she owned in the world, and against it she set her father's certainty and her neighbor's inevitable laughter, and judged the wager worth the making. She sent away by post for what the account called brick spawn, the thread-like beginnings of the pale mushroom, pressed and dried into small, dense cakes, ordering it from a nursery house in the eastern states, along with the few crude tools the work would demand. When the crates came down off the wagon, mud-flecked and stamped with the marks of their long rail journey, her father stood in the dooryard with his thumbs hooked in his waistband and watched her wrestle them to the ground. His chest filled with the old weariness, and it came out of him flat. What's all this rubbish, then? He was given over now to reading the financial sheets at the kitchen table, grumbling at the price of wheat. His insurance trade dwindled to a few old policies he no longer rode out to renew. An experiment. She did not look up from the rope she was loosing. Don't you stand there and tell me you mean to grow something down in that God-forsaken pit. There was no cruelty in the words. It was the plain and honest assessment of a man who had spent his life learning what that ground would and would not yield. I do mean exactly that. She got the first crate free and balanced it against her hip. He shook his head, the slow, worn gesture she had watched him make her whole life long, the gesture of a man declining one more time to argue with the weather. It is a hole in the dirt, Marin, a worthless hole in the dirt. Nothing good has come up out of that ground since the year the gate closed, and nothing good is going to. Then he turned back into the warm kitchen, the door swinging to behind him. The conversation ended in his mind as fully as if it had never opened. She stood a moment in the cold dooryard with the crate on her hip and the breath smoking from her lips, and she did not answer him, for she had long since learned that the only answer her father would ever credit was a column of figures, and those she did not yet possess. She possessed instead a sentence from a dead man's journal, a vault dug by the earth itself, and a patience her father had always mistaken for idleness. She shouldered the crate, turned her back on the lighted window, and walked toward the quarry to begin. Now, the value of the thing she began that winter lay not in the notion of it which any dreamer might have stumbled upon, but wholly in the execution of it, in the long, unglamorous labor of bending herself to a clock that ran not by hours, but by seasons. Everything in her father's world demanded a swift and visible return, the premium paid against the policy, the wagon loaded and weighed and sold by sundown. Everything in the world she now entered demanded the opposite, demanded that she plant a thing she could not see in a place she could barely reach, and then wait through the turning of more than a year before the ground would consent to tell her whether she had wasted her savings or changed her life. The method she had read of called for beds of composted manure laid in a dark room, and she would raise such beds in time, but she meant also to attempt a thing the account had never described, a crossing of two ideas that had met only in her own head. She had watched mushrooms rise of their own accord upon the rotting oak logs that lay tumbled in the damp lower reaches of the quarry, and it came to her that if the pale cellar mushroom could be coaxed onto manure, then some kindred fungus might be persuaded onto wood itself, onto sound oak inoculated, and then left to the cold, patient dark of the northern ledges. She would attempt both at once, the beds and the logs, the certain way, and the way no book had charted, because she could not yet know which the strange cathedral of the quarry would consent to bless. For the logs she needed oak sound, white oak cut in the dormant heart of winter, when the sap had drawn down into the roots and the wood held its sugars close. She owned a small woodlot of 5 acres, a few miles distant, and across 3 weekends in the bitter middle of February, with the trees standing leafless and asleep, she felled 4 of the soundest of them, herself swinging the axe until her shoulders screamed and the breath tore in her chest. Then bucking the trunks with a 2-man saw, she worked alone by main stubbornness. She was methodical past the point most laborers would have thought necessary, for she understood that every fault she let pass now would multiply through the long year of waiting. The trees had to be healthy, free of any sign that some wild fungus had reached them first. She cut the trunks into uniform lengths of 3 feet, choosing only the sections that ran between 4 and 6 inches through. A log thicker than that would take so long for the threads to claim that it might rot from a rival mold before her own colony could establish. A log thinner would surrender its moisture to the air and dry to dead wood before it ever fruited. The narrow band between those 2 faults was the only ground she would build upon. Then came the slow sacrament of the inoculation. She set up a bench in the corner of her barn and worked it every evening for the better part of 2 weeks, the lamp throwing her bent shadow huge against the plank wall, the cold deepening toward midnight until her fingers stiffened around the tools. Into each log she bored a careful pattern of holes, each one driven to the same shallow depth, and into each hole she pressed a fragment of the brick spawn she had soaked back to life, and over each fragment she dripped a seal of melted beeswax to guard the tender beginning from the wild spores that rode every current of air, waiting always to claim any opening left unguarded. The work was tedious, past description, the same motion repeated until the mind went somewhere else entirely, and the hands carried on alone, log after log after log, hundreds of small wounds open and seeded and sealed in the freezing lamplight. Her great-nephew, a boy of 14 named Jasper, came out one such evening to watch, drawn by the light in the barn. At an hour the rest of the house had gone to bed. He poked a finger at one of the cooling wax seals where it had purled over a wound in the bark. "What is it you're even doing out here?" The boredom in his voice was the bottomless boredom only the young can summon. Her hands did not pause in their rhythm. "I am planting a forest inside these logs." She pressed the next fragment home, dripped the wax, smoothed it with her thumb. "It will grow in the dark where neither of us can watch it. By the time it shows itself, you will have forgotten this evening entirely." He considered that with the gravity of the young, found it wanting, and pronounced his verdict. "Sounds about the dullest thing a person could do with a winter." He blew on his hands. "Can I go chop the kindling instead? At least that's something a body can see getting done." She let him go without rebuke, because the boy had named in his careless way the precise thing that divided her from every soul she knew. The kindling split, and stacked the policy sold, and paid the wagon loaded, and weighed. These were the works of her father's world works, a body could see getting done. What she did in the freezing barn would show nothing, for more than a year, would offer no proof against the long winter of her father's certainty, would ask her only to believe in a process unfolding in a darkness past all watching. She finished the last log near midnight, capped the lamp, and stood a moment in the sudden cold dark of the barn, listening to nothing at all, to the vast silent labor she had just set in motion, threads no thicker than thought, already beginning to feel their blind way into the heart of the oak. When the inoculation was finished, the logs had to be carried down into the quarry to incubate, and this was a labor that nearly undid her before the patient labor had even begun. She had chosen a ledge on the north wall, some 30 feet down from the rim, reachable only by the narrow, crumbling track the old quarryman had cut, a place her father had assuredly not seen with his own eyes in 20 years, since he had not descended into the pit once in all that time. The ledge lay in perpetual shadow, sheltered from the wind that scoured the rim, the air upon it cool and heavy and still as the air in a root cellar, with ropes rigged to a stump at the top and a neighbor woman from down the road to brace the line. Marin lowered the logs one by one over the lip and clambered down after each to stack them in an open crisscross that the air might move freely through. The rock bit her palms raw through her gloves. Twice a log swung loose and slammed the wall, and twice her heart stopped at the thought of it plunging the 100 feet to the blue water, carrying a fortnight of her evenings down with it. By dusk, every muscle in her back had turned to a single sheet of fire, but the stack stood complete on the ledge, dark and damp and waiting, and she sat upon the cold stone with her ruined hands open in her lap and looked at it a long while before she found the strength to climb back into the ordinary world above. Then began the waiting that was the true heart of the whole endeavor, the part no neighbor would ever credit as work, because it consisted to any watching eye of a woman doing nothing at all. The threads within the logs had to grow outward from each seeded wound until they had claimed the entire body of the wood, converting the dense sugars and fibers of the oak into the stored strength they would one day spend on fruiting, and this conquest could not be hurried by any means under heaven. It would take, by every account she had read, not less than a full year, and might take half again as long in the cold of the ledge. She returned every week through all that turning of the seasons, scrambling down the treacherous track in rain and in the first snows, and she did nothing there but look and touch and measure and write what she found in a small book she kept buttoned in her coat. She lifted the logs to feel their weight, and across the months she felt them grow heavier as the threads converted the airy wood into a denser, water-holding flesh. She watched for the first white showing at the cut ends, the sign that the colony had reached clear through the heart of a log and could go no further inward. She marked the temperature on the ledge and found it never climbed past 65 nor fell below 40, even when the fields above lay locked under snow and the wind across the rim could strip the breath from a person's mouth. Her father saw her come and go all that year, her boots forever caked with the pale clay of the track, her hands chapped raw, past the risks. "Still nursing your rotten wood, are you?" he would offer when she came in past dark, the words worn smooth by repetition into something almost gentle, almost like the things other fathers said. There was no malice left in them, only the genuine bafflement of a man watching his child squander her strength upon a heap of decaying timber. In his world, wood was for the building of a thing, or the burning of it, and to let it lie and rot on purpose was a waste so plain it scarcely bore remarking upon. She did not argue. She hung her wet coat by the stove, ate what supper had been kept warm for her, and went up to her room to read by lamplight of beds and spawn and the secret preferences of things that grew in the dark, and to wait out one more week of the long blind year. The first true test of everything she believed came not from the slow logs, but from the manure beds she had raised alongside them, and it came as a defeat that very nearly ended the whole affair before it had fairly started. A full year had turned when she descended one raw morning of the following autumn to inspect the beds where the pale cellar mushroom ought by now to have spread its threads through the composted earth, and what she found there stopped the breath in her throat. Across better than half the surface, a wild mold had taken hold, blue-green and sooty black in ugly spreading continents, choking out the pale colony she had labored to establish, the foul Swedish stink of it rising into her face when she knelt. A goodly portion of what remained had dried to a crumbling uselessness, for she had laid those beds in a hollow. She only now understood to lie in the path of a draught that crept along the wall and drew the moisture out of everything it touched. Of all that careful work of the manure hauled down barrow load by punishing barrow load, scarcely a fraction survived in any state worth the keeping. She sat down upon the cold stone of the ledge and did not rise for the better part of an afternoon. Below her the blue water lay flat and indifferent as it had lain for decades, giving back the gray autumn sky, and she looked down into it and asked herself for the first time since the notion had seized her whether her father might simply be right. A whole year gone, the greater part of her savings gone, with it sunk into spawn and tools and the long labor of her own back, and the ground had answered her with rot and dust. The thought rose in her seductive and warm as the first numbness of the cold water must have felt to that drowning boy, that she might climb the track, one final time fill in the beds, burn the logs for stove wood, and let the quarry be the worthless thing her father had always sworn it was. It would be so easy. It would cost her nothing further. It would prove him right, which was its own grim variety of peace. But patience, the true kind, the kind that had carried her watching, motionless for an hour, to catch a single slow change, is not at all the same creature as stubbornness, though the two wear one another's clothes. The difference between them is that patience learns. She drew the little book from her coat with hands that were not quite steady, and rather than surrender, she began to set down in her small, careful hand every separate thing that had gone wrong. Here the bed too dry for the draught she had failed to mark. Here the wax seal cracked along a log where the wild rot had found its doorway. Here a fragment of spawn that had likely been weak before it ever left the eastern crate. She turned defeat into a list, and a list was a thing a person could answer, item by stubborn item, and by the time the light had gone amber and long across the western rim, she had stopped grieving the lost year and begun against every reasonable counsel to plan the next. The whole grim morning of it she carried home in her face, and her father read it there, the moment she came through the door, the mud to her knees and the failure in the set of her mouth. Still tending the rot! He did not look up from his sheet, and so he did not see how near the words came to landing as the killing blow they were not meant to be. There's a lesson in it somewhere, I'd think, for a body willing to learn one. He meant, of course, the lesson that the pit was a pit and would forever be a pit, and she let him believe she had heard that lesson, because the lesson she had actually drawn from the ruined beds was one he would never in his life be able to hear, that the quarry had not refused her, only corrected her the way a hard teacher corrects a promising pupil, and that a correction is not the same as a refusal, and that the difference between the two was the whole narrow margin upon which she now staked everything she had left. She did the work again. She sealed the new logs tighter, melting the wax hotter so it ran deep into every wound before it set. She moved the beds out of the killing draft into a deeper pocket of the wall where the air lay dead and still. She passed the tools through a flame before each use, having read, at last, in a footnote she had skimmed past a dozen times, that the wild spores rode not only on the air, but upon any surface a careless hand might touch. Where her ruin had been carelessness, dressed as confidence, her remedy was a near religious exactness, and having rebuilt every bed and inoculated every log against the lessons of her failure, she climbed the track one more time and gave herself over once again to the only thing the work would ever truly ask of her, which was to wait through one more turning of the cold patient year, and to believe with no evidence on God's earth to support the belief that this time the dark would answer her with something other than rot. She had no notion climbing out of the pit that evening into the last red light of the year that a man in a fine coat would come down from the city before her mushrooms ever reached a market stall, that the whole township would one day pack a hall to decide the fate of the very ground beneath her ruined beds, that the name of her family's worthless whole would travel along the rail lines to tables she could not imagine in cities she would never see. She knew only the weight of the work behind her, and the longer weight of the waiting ahead, and she knew the thing she had said to no one, the thing she carried up the crumbling track like a coal cupped against the wind, that her father was not wrong about the world, only about this one wounded acre of it, and that the difference between them would be measured not in a season nor in a year, but in whatever the patient dark consented at the last to grow. The second year of waiting taught Marin a thing the first had not, which was how to bear hope and dread in the same chest at once, without letting either devour the other. She descended the track that next autumn with her jaw set against fresh disappointment, having schooled herself across the long months to expect a second ruin, so that a second ruin could not break her, and so she was wholly unprepared for what the log showed her instead. The cut ends had gone pale clear through the white of claimed wood, the threads having at last conquered the heart of every sound log she had sealed against her own past carelessness. She lifted one to her chest, felt the new and heavy waterlogged weight of it, the weight that meant the oak had been transmuted entire into the dense living medium she had read of but never held, and something in her that had been clenched tight for 2 full years loosened so suddenly that she had to sit upon the cold ledge until the shaking passed. The colony being established was only half the work, for a claimed log will sleep indefinitely in the dark, gathering its strength until something rouses it to spend that strength on fruit. The account she had read prescribed a shock, a sudden plunge in temperature meant to counterfeit the first cold rain of the turning season, the signal by which the wild fungus knows its brief window for casting spores has come. Other growers, the journal noted, soaked their logs a day in cold drawn water, hauled by the barrel. Marin had no need of barrels. She had 100 feet of mineral water lying still as glass at the bottom of the family wound, water held the year around at 52 degrees by the great cold mass of the stone. She lowered the first of the logs into that blue darkness on a rope, watched it sink slow beneath the unrippled surface, left it the whole of a day to take the chill into its waterlogged heart. The morning she hauled it dripping back to the ledge, the air there stood at 64 degrees against the water's 52, a gap of 12 degrees that she had not engineered but merely discovered a gift the quarry had been holding in trust through all its silent years. She stood the log upright against the streaming wall, leaned the next beside it, the next beside that, then climbed back into the upper world to do the hardest thing the whole enterprise had yet demanded, which was to wait 5 more days without descending once to check for. She had read that the disturbing of a log at this hour could persuade it to sleep again past all rousing. On the 5th day she went down. What she found stopped her on the last turn of the track. Across the bark of every soaked log, erupting from the seams she had sealed 2 years before, stood the first pins of the fruit-brown buttons, no larger than the head of a match, crowded thick as freckles upon a sunburnt arm. She knelt before them in the cold shade, as a woman might kneel in a pew, afraid to touch lest they prove some trick of the light, then pressed one gently with a fingertip, and felt the firm, small resistance of a living thing that meant to grow. 3 days more swelled the buttons into mushrooms, unlike any the eastern crates had promised, the caps broad and deeply umber, the gills beneath a clean pale cream, the whole of each one thicker and denser in the hand than any mushroom she had seen pictured or pressed, flecked across the cap with small pale spots of the kind she knew from her reading, that only the finest strains threw off in conditions of deep cold married to ceaseless damp. The quarry had not merely consented to grow her crop, it had improved upon every example the books contained, signing its work with those pale flecks the way an artist signs a canvas. The first cutting from the soaked logs came to better than 14 pounds, and she carried a basket of them up the track at dusk with the care of a woman carrying water in cupped hands. Into her father's kitchen she brought them, where he sat, as he always sat, with the financial sheet held at arm's length against his failing eyes. She washed a handful at the pump, sliced them thick, set them in the hot iron pan with nothing more than a knob of butter melting to brown and a scatter of salt. The way the journal swore best revealed the savor of a fine specimen. The smell that rose from the pan filled the small room within the minute, a smell of turned earth after rain, of toasted meat, of something dark and savory that went far past any mushroom scent the man had ever met across his long years. She turned the slices, let the edges crisp, then set a plate of them before him without a word, for she had learned across a lifetime that words spent on her father in advance of proof were words thrown down the pit. He set down the sheet. He looked at the plate the way he looked at a policy a stranger pressed upon him, expecting somewhere in it the catch that would cost him. He speared a single slice on his fork, turned it in the lamplight to study the underside, then put it in his mouth and chewed with a slowness that was its own kind of cross-examination. His face gave back nothing. He swallowed, considered, took a second slice unbidden, then a third, working through the plate with the methodical attention he gave to a column of figures he suspected of error. When the plate was clean, he laid the fork across it, looked first at the empty china, then up at his daughter standing rigid by the stove with her whole future hanging on a man who had never in his life praised a thing that could not be entered in a ledger. They're all right. He picked the sheet back up, shook it open, vanished behind it once more. To any listening stranger, it would have sounded like the faintest of compliments, grudgingly given, a thing scarcely worth the breath. To the woman by the stove, it landed like a cathedral bell, for all right was the highest word Silas Vance had ever in living memory spent upon anything that did not earn its keep in coin, and she turned quickly to the pan so he would not see what the 2 small words had done to her face. A thing may be good past arguing and still be worth precisely nothing, for the world brims with excellent things that no soul will ever pay a copper to possess, and Marin understood that the harder country still lay before her. Her first assault upon the marketplace was the Saturday farmers' market in the square at Bedford, a folding table she hauled in the wagon, a sign she lettered herself reading, "Vance Quarry mushrooms," a balance scale borrowed against her word. She priced them at 12 cents the pound, a bold figure in a county where another grower a few stalls down, a man who had sold there 20 years off sawdust beds in a heated shed, asked 8 for his pale, ordinary buttons. The townsfolk drifted past her table, took in the price, took in the strange, dark, robust things heaped upon it, so unlike the meek mushrooms they knew, then drifted on without breaking stride. By the closing of that first morning, she had sold a scant few pounds. The heap before her scarcely diminished, and Jasper dragged along to help at 16 now, and mortified to the soles of his boots, hissed at her across the unsold mushrooms. Not a blessed soul wants them. Can we not just load up and go home before the whole town sees us sitting here? The second Saturday ran the same barren course. The third, she dropped her price, swallowing pride, along with profit, and moved a little more, though never enough to call the thing a trade, rather than a humiliation conducted weekly in the public square. She was folding the legs of her table on that third afternoon, the failure sitting heavy and final in her chest, half persuaded at last that her father's verdict on the whole affair would prove the truer one, when a man stopped before the table who plainly belonged to no part of the county she knew. He wore a chef's coat pressed crisp and white beneath a town coat, carried himself with the contained intensity of a man who measured everything he looked at, and he did not so much glance at her mushrooms as study them. He lifted one, turned it slowly to read the gills, the cap, the pale flecks, then brought it to his face to draw its scent deep into him, the way a vintner draws a cork. "Where is it you grew these?" It was not quite a question. It had the flat certainty of a man who already half knew the answer and wanted only to hear it confirmed. His name was Julian Croft, lately come to the county to open a dining room in Bloomington, 30 miles north, a room already drawing the notice of the kind of people who traveled far to eat well and paid without flinching for the privilege. In the old Vance quarry, she told him, north of town, on oak logs mostly, the rest on beds. On oak. He turned to the mushroom again. "What is it you soak the logs in before they fruit?" The question struck her silent a moment, for in 3 Saturdays of indifferent passing trade, not one soul had thought to ask her how the thing was done, had cared the least particle for the method behind the strange dark flesh. "The quarry water," she answered him. "Off the bottom. It runs near to 50 degrees the year round, mineral heavy hard with the lime it comes up through." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the mushroom in his hand. "I can taste the stone in it. It's there in the finish after the meat of the flavor goes by, a coolness, a mineral edge. I've never met it in a cultivated mushroom in my life." His gaze rose at last to her face. "How many have you left on this table today?" 10 pounds near enough. The morning's been slow." It cost her to say it level, to keep the failure of the day out of her voice before a man who clearly knew worth when it lay before him. "I'll take the whole of it." He was already drawing a fold of banknotes from inside the white coat, counting without ceremony. "Every pound today, and whatever you can bring me next week beyond that. Don't carry them to this table again. Don't sell them to another living soul until you've sold to me first." He pressed a card into her hand with the address of the dining room printed upon it. "Send word by Friday how many pounds I can count on. I'll send a man with a wagon if I must." That afternoon in the emptying square was the hinge upon which the whole of her life turned, though she could not yet feel the swing of it. Julian Croft's room was built upon a single stubborn principle that a dining table ought to carry, the particular ground it stood upon, the rivers and woodlots and stony hill farms of southern Indiana set down upon China, and he put her mushrooms on his bill of fare by their full name, Vance Quarry, the way another house might list a fine vintage by its slope. The people who ate in that room were precisely the people who noticed such a line and asked after it, the editors and professors and traveling men of means who would pay $2 for a dinner and consider it cheaply bought if the dinner gave them a story to carry home. A week into the arrangement, he sent for her, and she drove the 30 miles north, with her stomach knotted against the certainty that he had found some fault, that the mushrooms had failed him under the lights of a real kitchen. She found him instead pacing the back step in a state she took at first for anger. "I've a problem, Miss Vance, and the problem is you." Her heart dropped clean through the floor of the wagon before he finished. "I cannot take them off the bill now if I wanted to. The room won't let me. I roasted them whole alongside a cut of beef this week past 3. Separate diners stopped me at their tables to tell me to my face that they had never in their lives eaten a mushroom to equal it. One of them, a man who has supped in the great houses of 2 cities. My costs are in ruins. I need to know what you can put in my hands every week reliably between now and the first hard frost that ends your season." She had done the arithmetic already, lying awake against this very question. The logs could be roused only in rotation, for a log, once fruited, had to rest near 8 weeks to gather strength for the next flush, a biological clock that no want of money could wind faster. 12 pounds, she told him, having counted it twice. 12 a week, dependable until the frost. I'll not promise a pound past what the logs can give without ruining them, and a ruined log is a year thrown away. 12 then, and I'll thank God for every ounce of it. He had stopped his pacing. I'm paying you 20 cents the pound, and don't you stand there and tell me it's too dear. She had in fact opened her mouth to say exactly that. It is not too dear. I charge near $1 for the plate that mushroom crowns, and the mushroom is the whole reason the plate exists. The men who order it are not paying for a fungus, Miss Vance. They are paying for a hole in the ground that everyone in your county swore was worth nothing. They are paying for the story of the stone. For the better part of 2 years, that arrangement was her living. A small thing, a steady thing, never once a fortune. Each week she roused her logs in their slow rotation, cut the flush at the hour the gills still showed pale, drove the 30 miles north to set 12 pounds in the hands of a man who had taught the wealthy to crave them. She expanded by inches, only felling more oak from the woodlot, inoculating new logs against the years to come, building sturdier racks along the ledge, forever holding herself back from the temptation to grow too fast, for the quarry's ledges could shelter only so much wood, and the slow clock of the fruiting could not be hurried by ambition any more than by need. Her father saw the small, dependable sums she brought home week upon week through 2 seasons, and somewhere in the second of them he stopped calling the logs her rotten wood. He began with a gruffness that was as near to surrender as the man could come to call it your mushroom business. 2 words that conceded more than he would ever say aloud. The peace of those 2 settled years was a deceptive thing, the stillness of a pond that gives no sign of the current running cold and strong beneath its surface, and Morin would come to understand much later that the quiet had lasted exactly as long as the wider world remained ignorant of what she had made. Word, however, is a kind of spore in its own right. It rides currents no one can see. A traveler eats a remarkable dinner in a Bloomington dining room, carries the memory of it home the way a man carries a splinter. He keeps worrying with his thumb, and somewhere in the telling and the retelling, the name of a worthless hole in the southern hills begins to travel faster than any wagon could carry it. The man who brought the trouble stepped down from the northbound coach at the Bedford Depot on a bright morning in the spring of the 3rd year, and the township noticed him before it knew his name, for he wore his difference the way other men wore their Sunday bests. His name was Cornelius Rourke, and he was perhaps 45, a man who dealt in railroad land and in the speculations that gather about a new line, the way crows gather about a fresh-turned field. He was smooth as poured glass in his manner, swift and certain in his speech, dressed in a suit of clothes that had cost more than a sound draft horse, and he carried a leather case of maps and figures, the way a doctor carries his bag, as a sign of the gravity of his calling. He had come south on behalf of interests in the city who meant to push a spur line through the county to feed the new mills rising along the rivers, with a settlement of workers' cottages to be raised wherever the ground could be had cheap. The Vance Quarry, 12 worthless acres that no living soul in 3 counties had ever found a use for, sat near the top of his list, circled in red ink. Rourke did not trouble himself to seek out Marin, for in his reckoning of the matter she did not so much as signify. A spinster growing toadstools in a ditch was not a party to a land negotiation. She was a curiosity, a thing one might remark upon over brandy. He went straight to the men. He understood the town council that would have to bless any rezoning, and to Silas Vance, in whose spotted, trembling hands the title to the ground still rested. He took a room at the Bedford House by the week, walked the rim of the quarry with his surveyor and his case of maps, while Marin watched from the cover of the scrub 100 yards off her heart, going hard against her ribs, and within a fortnight he had arranged to lay the whole of his scheme before a public meeting in the township hall. She went to that meeting because she could not have kept herself from it, and she went alone, and she went in her plain work dress because she owned nothing finer and would not have worn it if she had. The hall was packed to the back wall, every bench filled, men standing 3 deep along the sides, the air thick with pipe smoke, and the particular electric expectancy of a small place that sensed the possibility of becoming a larger one. She found a place against the rear wall where she could see over the heads of the seated men, and she waited, and she watched her father take a chair in the very front rank, his hat upon his knee, his ruined eyes fixed forward with an intensity she had not seen in them in years. Rourke was, she had to grant him, a master of his trade. He did not begin with the quarry at all. He began with the future, painting it across the smoky air of that hall in strokes so vivid the men could near taste it, a future of wages and depots and the wide world stopping twice a day at a platform of their own. He unrolled his maps upon easels, weighted their corners with smooth river stones he had brought for the purpose, and showed them bright renderings of neat white cottages ranked along graded streets where now there was only scrub and rock. He spoke their language, the only tongue the township had ever truly trusted, the tongue of money and progress, and the swift, sure return, and the room leaned toward him as a field of wheat leans toward the wind. "We are speaking," he told them, his voice pitched to fill the hall without the least apparent strain, "of an investment in this community, the like of which not one soul in this room has seen in the whole of his life. Wages for your sons so they need not board the train west to find them. A depot of your own with the commerce of the nation pausing at your doorstep. Fresh custom for every shop that fronts this square." He let the maps speak a moment, let the men's eyes wander the renderings, and fill the little painted windows with their own grandchildren, and then he turned with the timing of a man who has done this in 100 halls to the matter he had saved for its weight. He set upon the foremost easel a surveyor's drawing of the quarry, stark and graceless, a gray, ragged scar gouged into the green, checkered country, all about it rendered from above so that it looked exactly like what he meant it to look, like a wound, an absence, a blight upon an otherwise prosperous land. And in the doing of it, he said, his voice dropping into a register of grave civic concern, "We propose to heal a hurt this township has carried for the better part of a generation. This parcel as it stands before you is a dead asset. It is a hazard to your children, as some among you have the bitterest cause to remember." He let that land. He had done his reading in the county records, and more than one man in that hall flinched at the memory of a boy 3 days under the blue water. It returns to the county scarcely $1 of tax against the acre. We propose to fill it, to grade it, to raise upon it the single greatest engine of prosperity this corner of Indiana has ever turned with its hands. The murmur that ran the hall was the murmur of a congregation that has heard the promise of salvation. And then Rourke named his figure, and the murmur stopped, as though a hand had been laid across the mouth of every man present. His principal stood ready to lay down $1,000 in gold coin for the 12 7/10 acres of dead ground. For Silas, seated stiff and small in the front rank, it was the vindication of an entire lifetime. Arriving at the very dusk of it, long past the hour, he had ceased to pray for it. After near 30 years of begging the county to take the cursed thing off his hands for the price of a horse, here was a man in a tailored coat offering gold, real gold, a sum that dwarfed anything the dwindling insurance trade had ever heaped before him at one time. Marin, watching from the back, saw her father's hands tighten upon the brim of the hat in his lap until the knuckles stood white, saw the long stoop of his shoulders draw up as though a weight were lifting from them in that very instant, and she understood with a pang that what the stranger was offering her father was not money at all. It was absolution. It was the chance to die clear of the thing that had shadowed his whole accounting of himself, to balance at last the one page that had refused for 30 years to come right. The council president, a heavy-set man named Aldous Pine, who kept the feed store and wore his small authority like a tight collar rose, and called for questions from the floor. There was a shuffling, a clearing of throats, the ordinary reluctance of plain men to speak before a polished stranger. And into that hesitant hush, Marin found herself rising, who had come only to listen, who had no map and no rendering and no column of figures to set against the bright machine of the stranger's argument, who felt every eye in the hall swing toward her and fix upon the plain work dress among all those Sunday coats. Mr. Rourke. Her voice came out quieter than she had meant it to, and yet the hall quieted further, to take it in the way a room will lean toward a whisper it would have talked over had it been a shout. You have called the parcel a dead asset, a thing that returns the county nothing. He turned to her with the smooth and patient smile a man gives an interruption he fully intends to step across without breaking stride. That is the plain and documented fact of it, ma'am. By the county assessor's own roll, its productive value is as near to nothing as makes no practical difference. Last year, she said, and she made herself say it slowly, made herself hold his eyes, that dead asset returned better than $600 in clear profit. A murmur ran the length of the hall like wind through dry corn, and the stranger's smile held its shape, but something flickered behind it, a swift recalculation. From what precisely I have walked every foot of that ground. There stands no building upon it, no crop of any kind is filed against it in the county books. From mushrooms. A snicker broke from somewhere near the back wall, a single ugly bark of laughter, and Rourke seized upon it the way a drowning man seizes a thrown rope, his whole bearing relaxing into the certainty of a point already won. Ma'am, he said, and he let a note of weary indulgence creep into the word, a note that invited the whole room to share in his patience with the foolish. With all the respect in the world, we are discussing a railroad, a depot, a future for every family within the sound of my voice, and you are speaking to me of growing toadstools in a ditch. The hall laughed with him, then the easy, grateful laughter of a crowd that has been told whom it is permitted to mock, and Marin stood in the center of that laughter and did not sit, did not flush, did not drop her eyes. She waited. She had spent 2 years learning to wait on things slower and more stubborn than a room full of laughing men, and she let the laughter spend itself against her stillness, the way the cold water spent itself against the unmoving stone of the quarry walls, and when it had run out, the silence that came behind it was heavier and more uncomfortable than the laughter had ever been, because the room had begun somewhere in the dying of its own noise to feel the discourtesy of it. You see a ditch, she said into that silence, and still her voice did not rise. I see a cathedral. I see a growing room shaped and tuned across 50 million years by a patience that neither you nor the men who send you could purchase at any price you named, and the plain truth you have not troubled to grasp, Mr. Rourke, is that you cannot build what is already standing finished down inside that hole. The weight of the minerals in that water, the damp that never once breaks across the turning of a whole year, the cold held steady through August and January, alike by 100 feet of stone. These things together make a thing that cannot be raised again, anywhere upon the face of this earth, not for $1,000, not for 100,000. You propose to bury it under fill and gravel and call the burial an improvement. She drew a breath, and she felt the room with her now felt it turning, the way the logs turned heavy in her hands across the long months, slowly from the inside. I am filling that same hole season by season with a crop that the finest tables in 2 cities are at this moment begging me for and cannot get enough of. Your scheme would carry its profit north to men in the city who will never set foot in this county a second time. My small business at the very scale you find so amusing already returns 90 cents of profit upon the dollar. Were I to work that hole to the full of what it can bear, it would return its harvest, not to a stranger's ledger, but to a family that has bled into this ground. Across 3 generations of men you would have to dig up to ask. She turned then slowly, until she faced the stranger directly across the crowded, silent hall, and what she said next, she said not to him, but to every man in the room. His whole design is to destroy a thing that is one of a single kind in all the world, so that he may raise upon its grave a thing of which there are 10,000 already standing. Mine is to tend the thing that is one of a kind until it bears. He has built every figure on that easel upon the act of taking. I have built mine upon the act of growing. I will sit down now and let this room decide for itself which of those 2 arithmetics it would rather see its own name beside in 50 years. She sat, and the hall did not laugh. Rourke was a professional, and the chief mark of a professional is that he knows the precise instant the ground has shifted beneath his polished boots. A most interesting perspective, he said, and the smoothness of his voice had cooled, by some few perceptible degrees, the warmth gone out of it, the way warmth goes out of a room when a door is open on to winter. We shall weigh it, of course, with all the seriousness it is due, but the tide of the room had already turned, and every soul in it could feel the turning, the way a man feels the wind back around before the weather breaks. The neighbors who had leaned so eagerly toward his gold a quarter of an hour before, now looked upon Marin, one of their own raised among them, and they read in her plain, steady bearing a thing the stranger's bright maps had never once thought to promise them, a sort of wealth that did not pack up and ride north on the evening coach. The reckoning that truly mattered, though, came not inside the hall amid the easels and the weighing of figures, but afterward in the rutted dirt lot beside the wagons, where a single lantern hung from a post and threw its small, uncertain ring of light against the gathering dark. Silas was waiting for her there, beside their own wagon, and he was shaking, not with the palsy of his years, but with a fury she had not seen rise in him since she was a girl, a fury that had been building through every word of her speech, while he sat helpless in the front rank and watched his absolution carried off. What in the name of God was that performance? The words came out of him strangled, scarcely his own voice pitched low, so the men filing out behind her would not hear, which made them somehow worse than if he had shouted them across the square. $1,000 in gold. Do you have the first notion what a sum like that means to a man my age? What it would mean to lie down at the end, clear of that cursed hole at last, instead of leaving it hung round your neck like a millstone for the rest of your days. You stood up in front of the whole township, every soul I have known my life long, and you threw it on the fire for a mushroom hobby. It is not a hobby, father. She kept her own voice level against the rising tide, of as though her hands had begun to tremble at her sides, and she pressed them flat against her skirts to still them. It is a business, a better one with every season that turns. You have watched the money come into this house with your own eyes. You have held it in your own hands. It is a pittance. His voice cracked clean across the middle of the word, and the crack in it hurt her more than the anger had. Pennies against a fortune, and it was my one chance, my last chance, to be shut of that ground before they carry me out, to lie in the same county as it. This was the end of it. After 30 years, this was the end of the whole long curse, and you stood up in that hall, and you killed it with your own mouth. She looked at him, then really looked at the broken old man standing in the small ring of lantern light, with his good hat crushed and twisting in his fists, and the anger she might have answered with drained clean out of her, because she understood at last, with a clarity that arrived almost as grief, that the two of them had never once in all these years been arguing about money. They had been arguing about a boy of 14 3 days under blue water. They had been arguing about a father hollowed into a stooped, silent stranger. They had been arguing about every hope that had bloomed in him each spring and been crushed flat by autumn, about a whole life spent carrying a weight he had never been permitted to set down. "It is not a curse," she said, and she said it gently, which somehow cut deeper than any shout could have, the way a quiet word at a graveside cuts deeper than weeping. "It never was a curse. It is the only thing your family ever truly left you, and you have spent the whole of your life so afraid of it, so certain of what it would and would not yield, that you never once learned how to read what it was trying all along to tell you." He had no answer to that. There was no answer to it in the whole of his ordered, ledger-keeping world. He stood a moment longer in the lantern light with his ruined eyes and his crushed hat, an old man who had just watched his last prayer answered and then snatched away by his own daughter, and then he turned without another word and walked off toward the house on foot, refusing the wagon seat, refusing her, his bent shape swallowed by the dark between the lantern and the road. She climbed up to the wagon alone and took the reins in hands that would not quite go still, and she drove home the long way under the cold spring stars, and it was the last time the two of them ever quarreled aloud about the quarry. The silence that grew up between them in the weeks after was not the easy silence of a thing settled and laid to rest. It was the dense and waiting silence of a thing grown too large and too tender to be spoken of at all, and they carried it between them at the supper table each evening like a third presence neither would name. She had believed, driving home through that dark, that the stranger was beaten, that he would fold his bright maps back into his leather case and board the morning coach, and that the township's life would close over the memory of him the way the quarry water closed over a thrown stone, without a trace. That was how such contests ended in the few novels she had read by lamplight. The honest, plain-spoken woman, triumphant, the silken outsider routed and gone. Cornelius Rourke did no such thing. A week passed, then a second, and the town began to carry whispers of an altogether different shape than triumph. Rourke had not boarded any coach. He had given up his room at the Bedford House, only to take a better one, a suite of 2 rooms with a writing desk, and he had been seen at dinner in close and genial conversation with 2 of the 7 men who sat upon the town council, men whose enthusiasm for his depot, it now appeared, had not cooled the least degree for all her fine words in the hall. Worse word followed close behind. He had engaged a lawyer down from the city, a pale, precise young man who spent his days in the dusty record room of the county courthouse, bent over the oldest deeds and plats and the forgotten rights of way that lay folded and yellowing in the great leather books. Searching the clerk reported to anyone who would stand him a drink for some old lever, some lapsed charter or buried easement, by which the very groundwater standing in the bottom of the Vance quarry might be claimed as a public flow, the rightful property of a rail concern, and bent to the slaking of locomotive boilers. Marin understood the shape of the thing the moment the whisper reached her, and she lay awake the whole of that night while the house ticked and cooled around her, understanding it more deeply by the hour. The threat had not died in the hall beneath her words. It had only changed its costume. It had slipped off the bright public coat of the open offer, the offer that could be argued and shamed and voted down in the light where the whole township could watch, and had put on instead the gray patient garments of a thing that works in the dark, in record rooms and over private dinners in the slow accretion of small legal purchases that no public meeting would ever be called to bless. It worked, she thought, lying there in the dark, exactly the way her own threads worked, in the heart of the oak, claiming one small purchase and then the next invisibly, until one morning the whole of the thing was simply theirs, save that what this patient enemy meant to grow in the silence was not a crop. It was her ruin. She had won the room, and in winning it, she had taught her enemy the one lesson he most needed, which was to stop fighting where the township could see him. The harder war the one fought in dust and old leather, and the bending of forgotten law had not ended that night in the hall. It had only just been declared. The lawyer's letter reached her on a gray morning at the very end of the following winter, carried out from the Bedford Post by the same boy who brought the seed catalogs, and she read it standing at the kitchen table with her coffee, going cold and forgotten, at her elbow, the legal phrases marching across the page in their stiff black ranks like a column of soldiers come to take her ground. The county had set a hearing upon the matter of water rights to be held in the township hall in the second week of spring. Cornelius Rourke's principals would argue before the assembled council that the spring-fed water gathering in the bottom of the quarry was no private possession of any family, had never been deeded as such, but was a public flow of the kind the law had long held common to all, a resource that the chartered rail interest required to feed the boilers of the locomotives that would one day stop at the promised depot, and that her own practice of drawing upon that water to rouse her logs amounted to the selfish obstruction of a public good by a private party for private gain. She set the letter down. She smoothed it flat upon the table with a hand that had learned its steadiness across 2 long years of waiting in the dark, and she read it once more slowly, to be entirely certain she had understood the precise shape of the noose. If the council ruled for him, she would lose the right to the cold mineral water that was the whole and entire secret of her crop, the single irreplaceable ingredient that no other ground on the earth could furnish, the thing Julian Croft had tasted in the finish and called the stone. Without that 12-degree shock from that particular mineral-laden cold, her logs would sleep on in the dark and never fruit or fruit so feebly and so flavorlessly that no city table would pay a copper above the price of the common buttons grown on sawdust in a heated shed. The business that had at long last taught her own father to call her labor a business would die not in a season, not over the slow attrition of a bad year, but in a single afternoon of dusty argument in a hall that had once laughed at her and then fallen silent. She understood across the sleepless nights that followed that this second fight could not be won the way the first had been won, by a single ringing speech delivered to a swayable crowd, for she had already won exactly such a speech and watched her enemy simply pick up his maps and move the entire contest onto ground where eloquence counted for nothing and only old law and quiet influence held weight. This would be won, if it could be won at all, the way the threads won the heart of an oak log, slowly, patiently, by claiming one small solid purchase after another until the whole of it was hers and could not be taken back. And so she set about it the only way she had ever set about anything by labor that showed nothing for weeks, riding the rutted county roads in all weathers to gather to her side the allies that her quality and her quiet honesty had been earning her, all unknowing across the years she had spent simply doing the work well. Julian Croft came down from Bloomington of his own accord the very week the word reached him, before she had so much as thought to send for him, his white coat traded for a sober town suit, a thick folded sheaf of letters buttoned into his breast pocket. He came into her kitchen and laid the sheaf upon the table without ceremony. "You did not imagine," he said, "that I would sit 30 miles off and let them drown the one thing that has ever made my dining room worth the long journey south." The letters were in the hands of 3 other chefs, the proprietors of the finest dining rooms in Indianapolis, and in the city beyond it, each man attesting over his own signature and the name of his house that the Vance Quarry mushroom was a singular article of American commerce, unmatched upon any table he had ever set, drawing custom and renown not to one kitchen alone, but to the whole reputation of the southern Indiana counties as a country that could feed a discerning man. A council can be made to understand a railroad, Julian said, because every man in the room has seen a railroad. The harder thing, and the thing that may yet save you, is to make them understand that a man cannot taste a railroad. He can taste what comes out of that hole, and once he has tasted it, he will pay a coachman to carry him 100 miles to taste it again. You put that before your 7 councilmen, in the words of men who charge $1 a plate and turn custom away at the door, and you let them weigh it against the stranger's painted cottages. The second pillar of her defense she had to seek out for herself, and she sought him at the university in Bloomington on the strength of a single article she remembered reading years before in one of old Whitfield's bound journals, an article upon the porous limestones of the southern hill country and the behavior of water within them. The author was a professor of geology named Ellis Hartwell, a stooped and careful man with ink-stained cuffs and a scholar's deep suspicion of anything asserted without evidence, and when she had laid the matter before him in his cluttered office, he insisted to her surprise upon coming to see the ground for himself. He descended the treacherous track on his own stubborn insistence, refusing her hand to put his bare palms against the dripping walls and to crumble a fragment of the stone between his fingers and touch it to his tongue. And he climbed back to the rim slow and breathing hard, but shaking his head with a grim scholarly satisfaction that she did not yet understand. They cannot fill it, he said, standing at the rim and looking down into the blue water with the air of a man reading a page only he could see. More to the point, ma'am, they will not be permitted to fill it once this single fact is properly understood by men who must answer to voters with wells in their own dooryards. He turned to her, and his meaning was already plain in his face before he gave it words. This bedrock is porous past any safe reckoning. It is in the plainest terms a sponge of stone. Whatever fill they tip into that pit, whatever timber and refuse and city spoil rots within it, across the coming years, the seepage will carry the foulness of it straight down into the very same aquifer that feeds the wells of this entire township. The county's own surveyor said precisely as much when your father offered the ground for a refuse pit, and the rock has not altered its fundamental nature in the years since. To fill that quarry is in slow and certain fact to poison the water that every family in Hulitic draws up each morning to drink and to give to its children. Their scheme, ma'am, not your mushrooms, is the true public hazard here, and I will say so to your council under my own name and my own title. And it was there, hearing the professor lay it out in his dry, precise sentences, that Marin felt the deep, strange wonder of the thing settle over her, for the very porousness of the stone that made the water seep down, cold and mineral-laden, to feed her crop, its incomparable savor, was the selfsame quality of the selfsame stone that made her enemy's whole scheme a slow poison to the township. The quarry, she saw, was not merely the thing she was defending. It was defending itself through her turning the very geology that Rourke meant to bury under gravel into the argument that would bury Rourke instead. The third pillar of her defense she did not have to seek at all, for it rose up to meet her unbidden and unlooked for out of the township's own long and complicated memory of the Vance stone, when the hearing opened at last in the packed and sweating hall on a warm evening of early spring. It was the old men of Hulitic who turned the tide past any turning back, the gray and bent remnant of the 87 who had once drawn their living wage from Vance limestone, men whose own fathers had drunk from those same threatened wells, men who bore the quarry no love whatsoever for the backs and the fingers and the hearing it had taken from them across the hard decades, and yet who discovered in themselves, when the moment came, a sudden and ferocious love for the water their grandchildren drank. They had no stake in Marin's mushrooms. Several of them had laughed at her in this very hall a year before, but the water was another matter entirely. The water was their own, and one after another they hauled themselves up onto their unsteady feet, hats turning in their scarred and knotted hands, to say in the plain, unhurried speech of the hills that they would not stand by and see the wells of their own people poisoned, to fill the boilers of a railroad owned by strangers in a city not one of them had ever laid eyes upon. "Let the gentleman run his trains on water he owns," said one of them, a man named Eb Carver, so bent over his cane that he had to crane his neck sideways to address the council, at all his voice thin and cracked, yet carrying clean to the back wall, through a silence in which no one dared so much as shift on the benches. "He'll not run them on what my grandchildren drink of a morning, not while I have got the breath left in me to stand up in this room and say so." And he sat back down, and the hall did not laugh as it had laughed so easily at the woman in the work dress a year before. The hall listened, the council listened, and the long account of who had truly bled into this ground across the generations, and who had merely arrived on the spring coach meaning to turn a profit upon it, was at last read out plainly, where every man present could hear the full sum of it tallied. Cornelius Rourke lost, and Marin took a quiet and deliberate care that he should not be permitted to lose in the easy fading manner of a beaten villain who simply boards the evening coach and is never spoken of in the township again, for she had learned a great deal in those weeks of haunting the courthouse record room, and the chief thing she had learned was that men of Rourke's particular trade do not vanish when they are beaten. They withdraw. They retreat to a quieter corner of the board, and they wait for the township's attention to wander, and then they begin again by some new and patient route, and she meant this defeat to be of a kind that he could not simply work around in the dark once she had turned her back. He lost upon the geology, the porous bedrock, making the proposed fill a plain and documented danger that no councilman could vote to approve without standing up at the next election to answer for poison wells. He lost upon the swelled and furious chorus of the township's own old men. Every voice in the hall now ranged solid against his depot, and he lost last and hardest and most lastingly upon his own cleverness, turned back against him, for Marin had spent one careful afternoon furnishing a sharp young newspaperman from the Bedford Weekly with a set of dates and names and figures laid out in two neat columns, and the precise sums that Rourke had quietly pressed into the palms of two sitting councilmen broke across the front page of that paper on the very morning of the vote. The two bought men withdrew from the question in disgrace before the council ever came to ballot, their usefulness to the strangers spent and gone in the space of a single printing, their names a byword in the township for a generation after. Rourke gathered his maps from the easels with the unhurried economy of a man who has long since written the loss into his private accounts and means to be in another county by nightfall, rolling each one and sliding it into the leather case with the same smooth competence he had unrolled them. He paused once at the door of the hall, his hand upon the frame, and he found Marin's face among the crowd, and he gave her a small nod that held no warmth in it whatsoever, and yet she was surprised to find no real malice, either the curt professional acknowledgement of one tradesman to another who has simply proved to hold the better cards. Then he stepped out through the door into the spring evening and out of the township story for good and all, and the door swung to behind him, and that was the end of Cornelius Rourke in Hulatik. The tale might well have ended there, and ended happily enough, a quiet victory won in a small hall over a stranger's grand scheme, the mushroom business saved to go on turning its modest and dependable profit out of the family wound for as many years as Marin had the back to work it. But the world is a wide place, far wider than the township of Hulitik had ever had cause to reckon with. And now and again, when a thing is strange enough and fine enough and true enough, the world comes seeking it out, traveling toward it along the very iron rails that a man like Cornelius Rourke had hoped to lay for altogether different reasons. It began as such things so often do with a single man and a single dinner. A writer of the dining columns for a city paper traveling south on some other errand entirely stopped a night in Bloomington and ate at Julian Croft's table, and there he was served a portion of mushrooms roasted whole beside a cut of beef, and he carried the memory of that plate back north with him, the way a man carries the memory of a face he has glimpsed once on a crowded platform and cannot afterward put out of his mind. He set it down in print some weeks later, a few warm paragraphs under a heading that called the things the buried treasure of the Indiana hills, and the notice, small as it was, did what such notices do. It traveled. It leapt from the city paper into a monthly magazine of far wider reach, where an editor with an eye for the unusual marked it and sent a man of his own down south to see the curious business for himself and write it up at length. That man spent 2 full days at the quarry. He descended the crumbling track on his hands in places ruining a good pair of city trousers, and he walked the mossed and dripping ledges in the cold shade, and he knelt a long while in the gloom to study the dark-flecked mushrooms rising in their crowded ranks from logs that had been nothing but sound dead oak 2 years before, and he asked Marin a great many careful questions and wrote down a great many of her answers in a small leather book not unlike her own. The long piece he wrote ran on a Sunday in the autumn, in a paper read in every great house, from the eastern seaboard to the far western coast, and it ran under a title that named in 4 plain words the very thing Julian Croft had tasted at her humble market table years before any paper had thought the matter worth a single drop of its ink. He called it The Flavor of the Stone. After that, the orders came down the rails in a flood that Marin, standing in the empty Bedford Square with her unsold heap not so many years before, could not in her wildest imagining have foreseen. They came from the grand hotels of the eastern cities, from the famous dining rooms, whose names even she had heard, from the gold-flushed tables of the western coast, where men who had torn silver out of the mountains wished to eat the one thing that no quantity of silver could otherwise command. They did not haggle over her price. They did not so much as ask it. They begged only to be sold to at all, to have their houses added to the list, to be promised a single shipment in a single month. Marin found herself almost overnight the keeper of a waiting list that bore the names of the finest tables in the whole of the country, more custom arriving in a single week's post than her logs could possibly satisfy across a whole turning season, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her where it might have turned another's head, that the quarry remained bound for all its sudden and astonishing fame by exactly the same patient clock that had governed it from the very first day she carried a crate down the track. The 8 weeks a fruited log must rest. The long, blind year and a half a fresh log must spend claiming its own heart in the dark before it could fruit even once. She could no more be hurried into ruin by the hunger of the wide world than she had been hurried into it by the scorn of her own father, and she found somewhat to her own surprise that the 2 pressures felt remarkably alike, that the temptation to butcher the thing for a quick fortune was only her father's impatience wearing a richer coat. So she did not hurry. She brought Jasper into the business in earnest. Now the boy who had once begged to be led off to chop kindling rather than watch her seal her logs grown in the passing years into a young man of 25, with a clear, cool head for figures and a temper considerably steadier than her own. To him, she handed the ledgers and the orders, and the long, delicate correspondence with the distant kitchens, the saying of no to 9 houses out of every 10, and the keeping of the books that her father had he ever troubled to open them, would at last have recognized and approved. Freeing her own hands in this way, she gave them back to the only labor she had ever truly loved, the tending of the living dark upon the ledges, the lowering and the raising of the logs, the watching of the slow pins swell into fruit. Together she and Jasper felled more oak, always sparingly, always leaving the woodlot strength enough to renew itself across the coming decades, and they laid down the long, slow inoculation of 1,000 fresh logs against the years ahead, reckoning the full capacity of the quarry at something near 5,000 logs in rotation, and laying their plans across 10 patient years to reach it without ever once bleeding the ground white. She had built out of a thing that every sensible man in 3 counties had sworn upon his life was worthless, a business that could have swollen into a quick raw fortune within a single year had she only been willing to butcher it, and her steady refusal to butcher it was the truest measure of how little she had ever in her heart resembled the men who came to her door with gold in their hands and taking in their eyes. The notion of the auction was none of her own devising. It came to her by letter from a chef in the city, a correspondent of Julian Crofts, who staged each autumn a great charitable supper to fill the larders of a fund for the city's hungry, and who wrote begging her to donate a small lot of her mushrooms to be sold to the highest bidder among his gathered patrons. They will lose their reason over them, his letter promised her, in a confident, sprawling hand. The story is too perfect to fail the buried hole, the ruined family, the woman who saw what no living man could see. Let me set 2 pounds of your mushrooms before a room full of men who do not know how to lose, and let us both watch together what happens. She agreed to it in the end, far more for the sake of the fun than for any fame it might bring her, and she prepared the small lot with all the grave care of a craftsman, signing the work of a lifetime, choosing out the most flawless specimens of a single perfect autumn flush, cutting them at the exact hour the caps had opened full, while the gills beneath still showed their first virgin pale, and packing them with her own hands into a plain wooden box, bedded deep in the cool, living moss she gathered from the very walls that had grown them, which carries the whole of the telling back at the last to the unpainted pine kitchen on that autumn evening of 1889, to the old man bent over the single sheet of telegraph paper, to the silence with which this entire account of the wound and the woman who had learned to read it first began. Silas Vance was 78 that autumn, grown frail and uncertain in all his movements. His eyes failed at last to the point where he could no longer make out the financial sheets he had read across the whole of his long life, and he had consented after his own fashion, which is to say, without a word of warmth, but also without refusal, to wait out the evening of the auction at his own kitchen table while his daughter sat across from him. She had arranged for a man to ride the moment a result came over the wire at the Bedford office, 6 miles of dark road at a gallop, so that the news might reach this kitchen near as swiftly as it filled the distant city ballroom. Of that ballroom they would learn the full particulars only afterward, in a long letter from a guest who had been present, and a clipping from a city paper that Jasper read aloud to them both at this same table a week on. But the naked bones of it reached them that very night in the single breathless line the writer carried in through the door. The bidding had opened. The later accounts all agreed at $500, the pound, a figure that drew an audible gasp from a room which had flattered itself. It was long past the capacity for being astonished. It climbed past 1,000 within the first minute, past 2,000 soon after, with 3 separate men still raising their paddles when the auctioneer called 3,000, the pound, his voice riding the swells of the room like a revival preacher at the very height of his sermon. A factor from a great Eastern hotel had wired his agent in the room a standing instruction to secure the lot at any price the man judged reasonable, and through that patient agent the bidding came on, past every reasonable bound, 3,500, 3,008, the whole gowned and black-coated room turning its heads from one raised paddle to the next as though watching a contest of arms. The hammer fell at the last upon a figure that the guest's letter set down twice over, plainly distrusting its own pen, $4,217.30 for a single pound, and the lot being 2 pounds and 1/10 in its entire weight. It was carried away for the sum of $8,856.33, every last penny of it, bound for the larders of the hungry, a number the rider could scarcely shape with his own mouth for the strangeness of it. When the rider had gone back out into the dark and the door had shut behind him, no sound at all remained in the pine kitchen but the small, settling tick of the stove. Marin watched her father, who had laid the telegraph paper out flat upon the table before him, the way a man lays out a hand of cards he cannot make himself believe he has truly drawn, and who stared down at the figure printed there with a face from which every trace of color had quietly withdrawn, his expression past her reading. A full minute passed, in which he did not speak, did not stir, did not so much as lift his failed eyes from the number. He had spent the better part of 30 years, she knew better than any soul, living scheming and begging, only to be rid of the whole 12 acres and 7/10 for the price of a single $1,000, had near wept at this very table with gratitude when a stranger in a fine coat offered him that exact 1,000 in gold, and a slip of paper carried 6 miles through the dark had just informed him that 2 pounds of the fruit of that self-same ground had fetched near to 9 times the figure he had spent a lifetime begging the world to take the whole of it off his hands for. At the very last, he pushed his chair back from the table, rose with the slow, great effort his years now cost him, in every rising, crossed the kitchen without a word to her, and went out alone into the night. She thought, sitting on alone with the cooling lamp and the impossible paper between them, that the silence was the only answer she would ever have of him, that a man cannot at 78 unmake the whole shape of a lifetime's hard certainty, not even when the printed proof of his lifelong error lies spread before his ruined eyes upon his own kitchen table. Yet a few minutes later, the door opened again, letting in a breath of the cold autumn dark, and he came back into the lamplight, carrying something cradled with great care in both his trembling hands. He laid it on the table before her, a single sheet of paper, gone brittle and amber with the years, its ink faded near to brown, the original deed to the quarry struck off in 1851 with a signature dried at the foot of it that she had never once in her life seen, though she had carried the name her whole life long. He stood over it a moment, his breath coming short and shallow, and then he spoke in a voice gone all to gravel with age and with something else, something he had no practice whatever at saying, and had perhaps never said aloud in the whole of his life. Your grandfather. His unsteady finger came to rest upon the faded name, Corgan Vance, the stone-minded man who had knelt and put his palm flat against a cut face of pale limestone and bought 80 worthless acres before the week was out. He swore to the end of his days that the value was in the stone. He went down into the churchyard, certain of it, certain he had read the ground right and the whole township wrong. The old man's hand was not steady upon the brittle deed. He simply never lived to learn which kind of stone he meant. That was the whole of it. That was the entire confession of a man who possessed no other tongue for such things, and never would, who could not say the word sorry, nor the word wrong, nor any of the soft words other fathers spend so cheaply, and yet to the woman seated across the table from him, it was everything a lifetime surrender, laid down whole, in a single bent and broken sentence, the very nearest thing to an apology that Silas Vance had ever come to in all his years, or ever would come to before the end. She did not reach for him. She knew better than to reach for him. She only looked at the deed and at the trembling spotted hand upon it, and let the silence between them be for the first time in all those years a silence with nothing left unspoken inside it. The years that followed ran quiet in the way that the very deepest things in a life most often do. The Vance Quarry Company kept some 3,000 logs in their slow rotation along the widened and railed ledges, with Jasper running the daily affairs of it with a sure and steady hand, and 4 men of the township drawing a dependable weekly wage from the very ground their own fathers had stood at the gate of and cursed on the day it closed. They sold every mushroom the patient logs could yield at a single fixed and famous price to a standing list of the country's finest tables, and turned away 10 eager buyers for everyone they could supply, and remained by Marin's own deliberate and unwavering choice. A small thing, a stable thing, a thing of an almost embarrassing profitability that grew no faster in any year than the quarry itself consented to grow. The 12 acres and 7/10 that the county roll had once carried at the price of a fair saddle horse came in time to be assessed for the singular use to which one stubborn woman had bent it at a figure that would have struck even Cornelius Rourke himself, dumb in his fine coat, a value rooted not in any developer's grading nor any depot's daily traffic, but in the one wholly irreproducible fact of the place, the cold mineral breath of a wound that the patient earth had spent 50 million years in the preparing. Silas Vance died in the deep cold of the second winter on his long quarrel with the ground, laid down at last beside him in the churchyard, where his own father had gone before him, within sight on a clear day of the rim of the very pit. And it fell to Marin in the slow and sorrowful labor of emptying the house of him, to go at last through the drawers of the desk where he had read his sheets and kept his small ordered affairs in the clean columns he had trusted above all else his whole life through. There at the very back of the lowest drawer, tucked beneath a worn folder of paid and receipted accounts, her hand closed upon a small box of lacquered wood that she had never in her life seen before, and could not imagine her father troubling to own. She lifted the lid, not knowing what a man so spare and so guarded in all his sentiments could possibly have thought worth the keeping in such a thing, and within it, dried, hard, and dark, and yet perfectly whole upon a little bed of cotton wool gone yellow with the passing years, there lay a single mushroom. She knew it at once for what it was, though it had shrunk and darkened across its long keeping. She knew it for one of that very first cutting, that first 14 pounds she had carried up the crumbling track at dusk and laid sizzling in butter before him in this same kitchen more than a decade gone, on the evening he had eaten the whole plate clean and pronounced them in the only language he owned all right. He had taken one from the very pan that night, while her back was turned at the stove. She understood now, had dried it, with whatever care a man like him could bring to such an act, had laid it away in a box, bought in secret for the single purpose, and had carried the close secret of its keeping through every hard word he ever afterward spoke about her rotten wood and her worthless hole, through the whole long winter of the silence between them. Through the very night he stood beneath the lantern in the dirt lot and accused her to her face of throwing a fortune on the fire. It was his confession and his apology, and the whole of his buried and unspeakable tenderness, the one legacy he could never in life bring himself to put into a single word, set down and saved in the one thing he had ever kept that could not by any reckoning be entered into a ledger. Value in the very end is only a story that a people agree to tell themselves about the things their hands can touch. The age that was rising all about Marin in those years told a single story above all the others, a story of speed, of scale, of the swift, and the certain return, and it owned a fluent and confident language, all its own, a language of surveys and figures and the ever-rising worth of land, and it was a good story and a true one as far as it ran. Yet it was never the only story the ground had to tell. There was an older one lying beneath it, slower and far harder to hear, a story of attention paid across years that showed nothing for their pains, of a patience that learns where mere stubbornness only endures, of the deep instructed wisdom of a single place known utterly by a single watchful soul who refused to be hurried by greed or by scorn alike. It was a story that understood how a ruin in one man's reckoning may be the rarest treasure in another's, how the very wound that a family spends 3 hard generations cursing may yet prove the womb of everything that at the last redeems them. That story is not told in council halls nor printed in the dining columns of the city papers. It is written for those few with the patience to read it in the slow grammar of moss and cold water and stone, in the blind and faithful labor of threads working the dark of a dead log toward a fruit that no one yet living believes will ever come. It cannot be hurried, and its worth will never sit easy in any column a man like her father kept. But when it finally, at its own chosen hour, consents to bear, when the long buried thing at last breaks the surface of the dark and comes up into the light, it proves to have been worth more by every honest reckoning the world can bring to it than anyone who ever stood at the bare lip of the wound and looked down had dared so much as to dream.